Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. As Chris kindly pointed out, our sponsor for our Policy Lab is the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC for short. As part of the federal government's commitment to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050, CMHC has been working to progress this throughout the housing industry across the country. With this in mind, CMHC posed the following challenge question to us. What non-financial tools can the federal government implement to de-risk energy and resiliency retrofits while maintaining the affordability of Canada's private rental housing stock? We've been working on this challenge question for about the last 8 months or so, and we look forward to sharing with you all today what we've learned throughout this process.
Great, thank you. So to get us started, I'm going to go into a little bit of background that will help us shed some light on why this issue is important. Last year, the Government of Canada released its emission reductions plan, which laid out the roadmap by which the country would reduce emissions by 40% from 2005 levels by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Now, decarbonizing the building sector will be critical to this transition because currently buildings account for 18% of national emissions when you factor in their energy-related consumption. This represents the third largest source of emissions in the country. And the situation is even more pronounced in a city like Toronto, where buildings account for 58% of the city's emissions and represent the largest source of emissions in the city. Nationally, residential buildings account for 59% of building emissions, and contributing to this is the old age and consequent energy inefficiency of much of the country's existing housing stock. For instance, multi-unit residential buildings that were built before 2005 emit 50% more energy than those built today. In the Greater Toronto Area, as you can see on this graph here, the majority of the purpose-built rentals in that city were built over 40 years ago. And it's estimated that the current rental housing supply we have in Canada will still account for about 2/3 of the country's rental housing stock by 2030 and half by 2050. So, given the significance of residential building emissions, as well as the importance of this housing stock in continuing to meet the needs of a growing Canadian population, it will be imperative to focus on renovations that will improve the energy efficiency of the private rental housing stock. We will refer to these renovations as retrofits. And with that, we will get into a bit of the methodology. Oh, my apologies.
But before that, we're going to talk a little bit more about opportunities and challenges within the retrofit space. So, retrofits have the potential to reduce emissions from anywhere between 30 and 70%, depending on the type of retrofit installed. This, in turn, generates significant energy savings that can be as high as 60% for extensive or deep retrofits. Retrofits have additional trickle-down benefits that benefit landlords and tenants alike. For example, retrofits improve air quality, ventilation, comfort, and safety that can have long-term positive benefits on the health and well-being of tenants. This translates into increased tenant satisfaction, which in turn benefits landlords by reducing tenant turnover and vacancy rates so that landlords experience longer periods of uninterrupted rent. Retrofits also increase property values, reduce insurance premiums, and reduce maintenance and operating costs. In this way, retrofits have benefits for landlords, tenants, and the environment all at the same time. Moreover, retrofitting existing buildings is far less expensive than constructing new buildings or replacing old ones. So this makes retrofits the best path forward for reducing building emissions in Canada. However, retrofits can be expensive, ranging anywhere from $9,000 to over $100,000, and the deep retrofits needed to reach net zero are on the high end of this spectrum. Landlords don't want to pay for these costly retrofits because the energy savings that would have allowed landlords to recoup their cost over time without raising rent are actually incurred by the tenants, not the landlords. Meanwhile, tenants also don't want to pay for retrofits because they don't own the property, so they won't see any return on that investment if they vacate or are evicted from the property. This results in a split incentive that obstructs retrofits in private rental housing since neither landlords nor tenants are incentivized to pay for them. This presents a serious challenge for Canada's net zero goals. With that said, now let's take a look at the methodology.
Now, our sponsor, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, brings several strengths to this area. They can fund projects, they can convene stakeholders, they have an extensive business network to tap into, and they have the ability to frame powerful narratives. However, they're limited in their ability to directly shape government housing policy. We therefore need a whole-of-government and system-wide approach to making sure that housing retrofits can be adopted. That is the approach that we took while doing our research, and it's the approach that we're going to take during our recommendations today. We also realized that this is also quite an expansive topic, so after some discussions with our sponsor, we decided to focus on 3 key areas. We're going to be looking at energy retrofits because these have a greater capacity to directly reduce emissions, something that Canada has to do if it's ever going to meet net zero. The other thing we're looking at is private rental housing. The reason for this is because this is a bit of a policy gap. There are a lot of programs when it comes to housing, but private rental housing is typically not addressed as much. Finally, we will be looking at non-financial things, which to be clear, doesn't mean that we can't spend money, but it means that we won't be directly subsidizing landlords to do retrofits. This is because there are many financial tools either already in place or being developed. And also, as we touched on with the split incentive, access to money is far from the only problem when it comes to housing retrofits in Canada. This report gathers insights from desk research, literature review, stakeholder interviews conducted over roughly 8 months. We reviewed over 100 sources, we interviewed 25 different stakeholders, and we attended the Retrofit Canada conference. Now, apart from access to money, the 3 biggest problems that we identified is that there is a lack of data, there is a lack of trained workers, and there is a lack of coordination at all levels of this sector. This makes it complicated, expensive, and time-consuming for private landlords to install these retrofits. Therefore, we thought that the best way to encourage them to do it is to make retrofits easier, faster, and cheaper across the sector. And now we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into those issues.
Thanks, Simon. So as Simon mentioned, there's a number of key issues throughout this landscape. So for example, Canada currently lacks national building performance data. This obstructs energy savings estimates from being calculated and creates a major barrier for landlords since they are often only able to fully gauge the cost of the retrofits, but not the benefits. Additionally, there's a general lack of information about government programs among landlords. Landlords have many competing priorities and often lack the time and/or resources to learn about government initiatives. And most of the information about government initiatives is relegated to government websites that may be out of date or lack user-friendly interfaces. Landlords also generally distrust the government and assume that government programs will require significant effort for little gain. In this way, landlords not only often do not know about government programs, but are even incentivized to actively avoid them. This lack of data, in turn, obstructs green initiatives throughout the country, since neither public nor private actors have the information required to identify areas of need, monitor progress, and target spending. We also found a number of case studies in this landscape, the first of which is Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a free online building benchmarking platform that is increasingly being used by Natural Resources Canada, or NRCan, as well as other government agencies. However, the data this tool collects is often high level, is typically only accessible to building owners and government agencies, and it is limited in its relevance to Canada since the tool is actually owned by the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, and therefore provides Canadian officials with limited oversight and ability to modify or update the tool to reflect changing Canadian circumstances. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Department of Energy has a national and freely publicly available building performance database, or the BPD for short. The BPD functions hand in hand with other databases that already exist at the local, regional, and private levels by having these other databases feed into it. For example, contributors to the database include Energy Star Portfolio Manager, New York City, San Francisco, and Prudential. This allows building owners to compare their buildings to other similar buildings across the country and identify areas to improve on energy efficiency. Meanwhile, the European Union is going even further with Odyssey Muir. Odyssey Muir reflects a harmonized approach to building data collection by collecting information on building performance, as well as energy policies and government programs, at the local, national, and regional levels. The EU has recently renewed its commitment to Odyssey Mirror by expanding it to an additional 8 countries and by adding an integrative tool that assesses energy policies, quantifies their contributions to emission reduction targets, and recommends additional policies to further promote those efforts. So with that, we'll go to our next issues.
Thank you. The second issue that we identified is that at the moment, the construction industry can't meet the current demand for retrofits. This means that if we are to give in more incentives for retrofits, it won't necessarily result in more retrofits actually being installed. In other words, Chris, this is not a demand-driven market. This is for a couple different reasons. First of all, there's an absence of pathways from school to trades. This means that there's less Canadians picking careers within the trades, which makes the pool smaller. Furthermore, because of negative experiences with poorly trained workers, landlords tend to only work with a few trusted firms. This means that the pool of firms that can actually enter the market is relatively small, which shrinks the pool even more. Additionally, there's a shortage of raw materials when it comes to the construction industry, which increase costs. This means that there is an added risk for landlords when they're trying to install these retrofits. And finally, firms and landlords are hesitating to train their workers or install new technology. This is because they're not sure if it's worth the investment. They're not sure if it's actually going to be done effectively, again, because of poorly trained workers. During our research, though, we found a couple different organizations or programs that are trying to do something about this. The first is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which is a labor union that represents electrical workers across Canada and the United States. They run a training program out of almost all of their chapter houses. This raises the standard of work across the electrical industry and crucially raises trust. When you are working with an IBEW member, you know that the member will do the job correctly. This allows more members to actually enter the market, which is a problem that we addressed earlier. Another example that we have is something called the Red Seal program. This is essentially it's a super certification. Once you've done 5 years of apprenticeship, you can apply to take the test, to take the course, and once you have your Red Seal, you're able to do your work in any province in the country, regardless of where you got your certification. Again, this allows people to move from place to place. It allows them to move to hot job markets, and again, it raises trust and ensures that the firms have access to well-trained workers to do the job right. Now to our final issue.
Wonderful, thank you. So the third key issue area that we identified was in the area of coordination. Due to the complexity of the current retrofit market, there is a high need for coordination at a high level among government actors, as well as on the micro level between individuals. Individuals, and particularly small landlords, face significant barriers to participating in retrofits currently, and many may get only as far as the home energy audit before realizing that they lack the time, the capacity, the resources, or the knowledge to move further in the process. And though some local services have popped up to mitigate these barriers for individuals, the majority of federal programming currently focuses on funding coordination services that take on larger, deeper retrofits. For instance, NRCan's Deep Retrofit Accelerator initiative targets deep retrofits in commercial, institutional, and mid or high-rise multi-unit residential buildings. And while this is a step in the right direction, it does leave out many of the community level and individual-to-individual services that may be needed to bring more people on board to conduct retrofits. Often the areas of the most need are also the hardest to reach, and they may also benefit the most from retrofits. Again, working with small landlords and those who rent out secondary suites. In Ontario, 49% of the rental housing is owned and operated by small landlords. And in the Greater Toronto Area, 90% of the growth in the rental housing market, that demand has been met by the secondary market. Furthermore, in metropolitan areas throughout Canada, the number of secondary suites that are rented out, those suites that exist within an existing home and are rented out as a secondary unit, are often unknown. The numbers are hard to estimate because they often have an entrance that's on the side or in the rear of the building, making them hard to identify, to locate, let alone to include in large aggregated projects such as those that are currently being targeted. As such, there's a gap in who is being reached by current programs, and this gap must be filled going forward. We took a look at various case studies to shed some light on how different forms of coordination can be conceptualized. So in Canada, there's Pocket Change, which is a neighbor-to-neighbor retrofit coordination initiative that exists in Toronto and connects neighbors to their next step retrofit. The Green Block Neighborhoods Initiative in Vancouver was an initiative that facilitated dialogue between neighbors and allowed them to build the capacities to coordinate with one another to take on sustainability-related projects. In the UK, there are national codes and standards for retrofit processes, which ensure a consistent framework across the whole country for these projects. In the Netherlands, there is the Energy Sprong model, which is highly centralized and streamlined, and which was initially designed to pool groups of social houses through their associations to undergo simultaneous retrofit projects. And in the EU, there are one-stop shops for retrofits. These are guided by a standardized model that was developed by the European Infrastructure Bank and the European Commission. Individual EU member states can then adopt that model, as well as the municipalities within them, and adapt them to the local needs of their communities. So as you can see, there are many different ways to think about coordination at many different levels. And with that being said, we will now take a look at some of the recommendations that we have to address the key issues we've identified.
Thanks, Abigail. So our first policy recommendation is that NRCan, with the support of CMHC, should develop a national and publicly available database on building energy performance. This database should combine the best features of the case studies we described earlier by including information on building energy performance, as well as information on energy policies and government programs. Yet this database should go one step further still by also directing users to retrofit resources that are crafted toward individual users based on their zip codes and building profiles, thereby channeling relevant information directly to users. This will have a number of beneficial trickle-down effects that will make retrofits easier, cheaper, and faster. For example, the aggregation of large-scale data enables statistical modeling that can calculate energy savings estimates much more accurately, cheaply, and easily than is currently possible, thereby making energy savings estimates more predictable and accessible for landlords of all sizes. In turn, this also supports landlords in identifying not only areas to improve on energy efficiency in their buildings, but also what type of retrofits to pursue and how to go about pursuing them. Moreover, this database will facilitate access to resources that landlords need to not only pursue retrofit projects, but more importantly, to complete them. And it will do this by providing information to landlords about government programs and coordination service providers that can help them to hire skilled workers, for example, or apply for government subsidies so they could pursue retrofit projects from start to finish. NRCan is well suited to do this since it already has experience with databases through its work on Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Additionally, NRCan's work on CanQuest energy modeling software demonstrates that NRCan has the skills to develop and maintain online tools. NRCan should leverage this experience combined with its extensive knowledge about energy policies and programs to design a database that can be an all-around resource for actors across the retrofit industry. CMHC is well positioned to support this initiative due to its long-standing partnership with NRCan in advancing energy efficiency throughout the country. Additionally, CMHC has an extensive network of contacts that it can leverage to convene actors in both the public and private sectors to inform the development and maintenance of this database, and finally, to promote it, to facilitate its success. In this way, this database will enable retrofits and other emission-reducing green initiatives across the board, from individual building owners to municipalities and provinces to the federal government at large, to help to achieve the nation's net zero goals. And with that, we'll go to our second policy recommendation.
Thank you, Nicole. Our second recommendation is the Ministry of Employment and Social Development create a national training curriculum for energy retrofits. It will be delivered through Canada's trade schools and will be developed in partnership with industry leaders as well as the trade schools mentioned earlier. During development, there will need to be extensive piloting to test the curriculum both within the classroom and also on the job site. As the deliverers of the program, trade schools will need to be brought on board. This can be done in a couple ways. First is by pointing out the benefits, such as addressing skill gaps, student outcomes, and better employability. Evidence of this will be drawn from the piloting that we will be doing during development to gather information and testimonials. We will also need to do a bit of funding. ESDC can give an annual financial package to trade schools drawn for the national budget, but this is an area where the CMHC can directly contribute as well. they can help fund the project, as well as using their convening power and business networks to draw funds from other levels of government, as well as from the private and not-for-profit sectors. If this is done, it will help trade schools with implementation costs, as well as with the long-term delivery costs. We will also need to be consistently keeping the curriculum up to date to make sure that as new technology comes out, workers can receive the most up-to-date training. This will make it easier, cheaper, and faster for landlords to install retrofits by increasing the number of trained workers directly, increasing the pool. It will also increase the general trust level that landlords will have towards firms because they will know that the workers will be trained. This will allow new firms to enter the market through word of mouth, which will increase the pool even further. It will also offset the increased costs of raw materials by making sure that the work is done more efficiently, faster, and without mistakes. And finally, it will de-risk the adoption of training for new technology, and therefore the adoption of new technology by landlords, meaning that we will have the most up-to-date retrofits installed in buildings and therefore reducing GHG emissions further. Now to our final recommendation.
Great, thank you. So our third recommendation falls in the area of coordination. So we do recommend that CMHC partner with NRCan to leverage the convening power of those two organizations to establish a retrofit commission. This commission would include representatives from all provinces and territories, retrofit industry leaders, municipal housing organizations, other housing specialists, as well as landlord and tenant associations. Now, this diverse and multidisciplinary commission could then utilize their perspectives and their insights to create a comprehensive toolkit for coordination services. This toolkit would inspire action on retrofits while providing national support for communities to build the capacities that they need to take on coordinated retrofit projects. This toolkit will help all forms of coordination services because it can be used by anyone. However, it will be especially helpful for community groups who lack the resources or the existing capacities to take on these projects in a coordinated manner. And given the scope and the scale of retrofits that are required for Canada to meet net zero targets, and the diverse needs of communities across the country, it will be vital to promote and empower a diverse range of retrofit coordination services across the country. The toolkit can do this by providing the information, the resources, and the guidance for coordinating projects. The toolkit could include methods for community outreach, guiding principles for maintaining housing affordability and tenant protections, best practices for engaging with and between tenants and landlords, processes for accessing and coordinating financial solutions such as grants, loans, and subsidies that could be pooled for collective projects, and guiding practices for engaging with contractors and aggregating their projects together for those contractors. We further recommend that this be complemented by a system for peer-to-peer learning, by which these community groups could access a space to learn from one another. We recommend that the Commission hosts annual retrofit forums to bring together these toolkit users so that they can collaborate with each other and identify opportunities for further collaboration not only amongst themselves, but also with industry leaders and government officials. And so rather than starting from scratch, communities can work together and coordinate projects with confidence, with the support of the government as well as a network of other communities who are using the toolkit. This will make retrofits easier, cheaper, and faster by enabling a variety of coordination services to proliferate across the country. It will also build capacities in local communities to coordinate projects and to expand their services. A consistent theme that we heard throughout stakeholder interviews was the importance of word of mouth. When someone hears that their neighbor had a positive experience with a contractor or with a program, they tend to trust that source of information far more than any ad or website that they come across. And so there is immense potential for tapping into this sort of influence between neighbors and within communities to advance retrofits in the country. By supporting community-led initiatives with this toolkit, the government can fill an important gap. A gap that can and must be filled if Canada is to undertake the number of retrofits that are required to meet net zero and to bring everyone along in the process. Now we're going to take a look at how all of our policy recommendations fit together.
Thank you. As you can see by our very cool graphic, each of our recommendations is meant to fit together as a cohesive policy package, feeding a positive policy loop. For example, If we look at it, the database addresses areas of need for the training curriculum and also facilitates resource access for the toolkit. The curriculum, it connects groups of suppliers for the toolkit and forecasts industry trends for the database. And the toolkit aggregates projects for suppliers and contributes data to the database. This is just a few of the examples of the synergies that our policy package provides. It's a whole-of-government approach that, if it's fully implemented, will take us in the right direction of making sure that retrofits are easier and cheaper and faster for landlords to install in Canada's private rental housing stock.
And it's also too important to consider the integrated costs of this policy package as well. Each of the policies that we've recommended do come with considerable upfront costs, but these do reduce over time as institutional capacities are built and knowledge and systems are built as well. The highest costs are associated with the database due to the upfront technology development costs. However, because CMHC and NRCan do both have in-house research teams, and because NRCan has past experience with databases and software development, there could be an allocation or a reallocation of resources from within existing departments rather than entirely new hiring. Additionally, they could choose to work with a private partner to run the project. After the database is set up, there would be maintenance costs, but this would be considerably less than the upfront development. The training curriculum would also come with upfront development costs, as well as with connecting with the trade schools initially. However, as the curriculum is built up and the reputation is increased over time, and as workers and trade schools are brought into the fold, the annual funding packages that we mentioned could actually be phased out over time as well. Furthermore, for the third recommendation, the main costs are associated with the formation of that retrofit commission, the development of the toolkit, and the annual forums. But once the toolkit is set up, the ongoing maintenance would be periodic updating to the toolkit as well as those community forums, which would reduce over time as well as systems are built up and processes are established. Furthermore, costs would continue to decline as the retrofit market develops and as new lessons are learned across the government and within communities.
Throughout this process, CMHC has a critical role to play. CMHC can utilize its extensive network and a skill for crafting powerful narratives to promote this policy package across the country through a comprehensive public engagement strategy. This should include coordination with media groups, communications with public and private partners, and an advertising campaign to get the message out. This should also be supplemented by general education for all Canadians about the importance of energy efficiency to promote the shift in consumption habits needed for retrofits to be effective and net zero to be reached. CMHC is well suited to this due to its well-known and generally positive reputation in the housing sector. This makes it essential that CMHC's brand is on each of these policy recommendations to provide them with the credibility and momentum they need to succeed. However, there is still a general sense of distrust among landlords toward the government that necessitates that government initiatives are bolstered by private support. As a Crown corporation, CMHC is well situated to do this due to its extensive network with both public and private partners that can serve as a foundation for supplementing CMHC's brand with private vetting to build the trust and confidence that landlords need to pursue retrofit projects and bring them on the journey to reach net zero by 2050.
2 minutes, okay. Great. So overall, this policy package is designed to accelerate retrofits while maintaining affordability in the country's private rental housing stock. Maintaining this affordability is critical for meeting the needs of a continuously growing Canadian population. By lowering price pressures and making retrofits easier, cheaper, and faster for private landlords, this integrated policy package will maintain affordability in the country's existing housing stock, while lowering emissions and making progress toward Canada's net zero goals in the process.
Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Additional thank yous to our sponsor, the CMHC, our coach, Leslie Fierro, our coordinator, Natalie, and for all of you to listening. We will now answer your questions.
Well, who knew energy retrofits could be so funky? Okay, we're gonna start off with I think Shakir. You're gonna start us off.
Yep. No problem.
Thank you.
So great presentation and good use of case studies throughout. My question is pretty much we've talked about this a few times today, and it's just the jurisdictional challenges. So your second recommendation in terms of training, right? Like, how are you going to get the provinces on board with this? Especially because, one, this is not like a housing supply issue, it's a GHG reduction issue, which I would say a lot of premiers across the board don't have an equal emphasis on it. But two, like Alberta, Ontario, they have their own kind of skilled trades training programs. And their view is usually give me the money and I'll do what I want to do with it. Don't tell me what to train people on. So just curious what that engagement strategy looks like and why would they buy into this for reasons like they don't care about the emissions at the same level or they're already doing training in their jurisdiction, right?
So we each have separate answers for this, so I think we'll all give it a crack. But in terms of the training curriculum, we actually designed it very cleverly to get around that. You notice that it's a training curriculum that can be adopted voluntarily. We're not actually, this isn't the federal government telling the provinces to adopt a training thing. It's developing a curriculum and then funding schools to do it, right? So it's actually not a jurisdictional issue at all for the training program.
So each of our programs or policy recommendations have similar ways of getting about the jurisdictional issue because that's something we definitely thought about a lot while writing these policy recommendations. So in the case of the database, for example, it's also not required for anyone to necessarily contribute. This is the same way that the BPD or the Building Performance Database functions in the US by not making it required for people to, or organizations or cities or states to contribute, but rather have it on a voluntary basis. Additionally, there's already a number of databases underway in Canada at the local level. So, for example, Edmonton, through their building benchmarking program, is collecting data on the building energy performance of the buildings in that area. However, it's limited just to that area, right? And so you see this repeating throughout the board or across the board in Canada, where we have these local databases, but because they do not collect information that is actually accessible to everybody else and consolidated in a easy-to-use forum, as a result, it makes it really difficult for actors in the retrofit industry to actually utilize that information.
The question was mostly for the second.
Yeah. And I guess the final point on this is that there are many federal programs that are essentially funding things that are done within provincial jurisdiction, right? It's more of an administrative versus cost thing, right? So yes, we would have to get the provinces on board, but also it's worth mentioning they are highly incentivized to get on board with this, right? I think all of them have made actually a commitment to net zero, roughly along the same timeline as the federal government. In addition, they all have an interest in getting access to information, they all have an interest in getting access to training, and they all have an interest in getting access to the coordination. Now, obviously, a lot of our recommendations will have to be filtered through the lens of the different provinces, and that's why a lot of them will require some coordination. But frankly, because it's a funding thing, and because it's a voluntary thing, there aren't as many jurisdictional issues as you would think.
Okay, Brenda.
That's kind of hilarious because when Shaq asked his questions, both Ian and I grunted. So I think that was both of our first questions as well. So I won't belabor it because you did a pretty good job of at least defending it. Let's put it that way. So let me switch to another question, and that is on the national database, because among other things, you said that was the most expensive component of this. And I can see a database for two different reasons. One might be to track our performance as a country in this particular area, but that's not really what you talked about. You talked about it, the other piece, which was kind of sharing information and knowing what's effective and getting people to buy in. And so I guess I'm just wondering if it's it's something that's voluntary, that it's hard for me to imagine why people are going to choose to enter all of their data. And I guess if what we're really looking for is best practices, what's really effective, do we actually need a database to do that? In a sense, couldn't we rely on the EU's Odyssey that you talked about or other things? So, sorry, just to add one more thing. I've worked in energy for about 30 years, and we've known for pretty much all of that time what's effective and what's not. So it's not really, I think, a question of figuring that out. It's just the second part, which is disseminating that information. And I'm not sure a database is anyway. How does the database fit into your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your questions. There's a lot in there, so I'm going to try to address what I can, but if I miss something, just please let me know. But for us, what we found is that landlords, or at least the landlords and the landlord associations that we spoke to, they found that one of their biggest barriers for actually pursuing these costly retrofits was a lack of information, especially not being able to understand the energy savings that you can actually gain from retrofits in their individual buildings. It's one thing to say that they can save up to 60%, but people want to know actually how much are they actually going to save, right? And we found that there's a number of studies out there that show that right now many building owners have to rely on engineering modeling rather than statistical modeling in order to calculate energy savings, because there's just not enough data out there for statistical models. But these engineering models, engineering models are far less accurate. So we found a number of studies that say that engineering models have, I know I keep wanting to say energy models, they're engineering models. The difference between the energy savings they estimate and energy savings that actually end up being the case can be anywhere between 25 and 50% of a difference. So that creates risk for landlords that they're generally speaking not willing to take on. Whereas if we have a large pool of data, you could do statistical modeling, which is far more accessible because you don't need an engineer to do it. And also it just makes everything a bit more accurate. So this would de-risk these energy retrofits for landlords. As for the voluntary bit, I think this goes to what Simon was talking about earlier, is that many provinces and municipalities throughout the country have already committed to reaching net zero. And some municipalities have gone even further, such as Toronto, which is trying to reach net zero by 2040, not 2050. So this creates sort of a built-in incentive for them to want to contribute to a database that should make retrofits easier, cheaper, and faster to install, putting that back out there again, by providing information to landlords. In addition, though, we don't want this to only be something that tells people about building energy performance. We also want it to be something that tells people about what kind of resources exist for them to actually help them to get this done. So sort of like what Abigail was talking about how many landlords only get up to the energy audit before realizing that they don't have the time or don't know who to contact. What kind of contractor should you hire? My parents have been trying to do a renovation of a bathroom for 10 years, it feels like, so it's really difficult, right? So this would actually direct people based off of their building profiles and their zip codes to things that are directly relevant to them, including government programs or coordination service providers and skilled contractors.
Ian Scott.
Thanks, but you've both taken all my questions. You almost have me stumped. The bathroom renovation problem is just colors. That's okay. That's why they just can't agree. I've been through this. I'm going to go back to the first question because I'm still I'm stuck on it. Not as clever, yes. Not as simple as you think. I think your point was provinces tend to say, "Just give me the money. I don't want strings attached." Moreover, some of the most effective strategies are inconsistent with provincial ambitions. Simple example, let's reduce the use of natural gas because it's a major contributor. Let's all go to heat pumps. Quebec, with all of its abundant hydroelectricity says, yes, baby, let's do that. Alberta, not so much. So I'm kind of harping on it, one, because I'm not clever enough to figure out another completely different question. But I think I think there's a little more. So maybe to be a little specific, so what's the sort of legal basis for the commission? Like, where would it derive its authority? Because that goes to a lot of the second issue of voluntarily providing data where maybe they're not so cooperative, or on what basis, are you trying to get me to follow a particular skills, even the code, electrical code varies between provinces. Absolutely. So I'll try again. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so just to clarify, was your question about the legal status of the commission or the training program?
The last part. I mean, I just meant that's as an example. I'm still stuck on it's hard to take to impose, if you will, a federal initiative on the provinces. But I'm using the commission as an example. What would be its status, or where would it derive its authority?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think the way we were thinking about it was through providing those annual funding packages. And I understand the point about there being strings attached to it, but your example about the heat pumps is significant because that is an example of a technology that can be trained on and applied in these schools and would allow workers to then install that technology across the country. And it may not be applicable now in, say, Alberta, but it will be into the future. And so part of this is investing in a nationally cohesive retrofit mission in which we identify things and we harness the capacities that exist at the federal level, such as the research teams that exist at NRCan and at CMHC, to identify trends, to identify local variations, and to actually assist trade schools in identifying areas of need and targeting training where it's needed most. And so the national curriculum would have the advantage of being pooled in a national manner, but which could be adapted to local contexts as well to identify what works here might not work there. In our extensive policy recommendation, we also do recommend a piloting, which would help to identify those local variations, to identify opportunities for collaboration with the trade schools, and to identify what that local industry looks like. What are the regional supply chains that actually exist there? What do they look like? And what sort of training model makes sense there? So the piloting would allow for some of those things to be fleshed out. Furthermore, yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yes.
So, and just a general comment across the board here is that that's why we identify CMHC and NRCan in particular as being really important to many of these initiatives, because they have a wide, extensive array of partnerships in both the public and private sectors, as we've touched on in our presentation. So, and CMHC, they've told us themselves that one of their skills is convening people, and we want them to tap into that skill for each of these initiatives. This way you could tap into provincial, municipal, and private actors as well, to make sure that everyone has some level of buy-in and is willing to support this. This will also align with the government's whole of government approach that it's been taking to building emissions, or emissions just in general throughout the country. In addition, NRCan is currently in the process of developing the green building strategy, which is not yet developed, but it is in the process, and this is going to be touching, many of our recommendations touch on what we hope will end up being in that type of strategy that hopefully municipalities and provinces, hopefully that will provide the momentum for provinces and municipalities to further want to be on board.
Yeah.
Okay, Simon, real quick word, go for it.
Yeah, just real quick. It's also worth noting nothing is being imposed here, right? What's happening is that we're creating programs and then we're providing incentives to adopt them, right? CMHC actually does this all the time. So they create sort of housing frameworks and they create housing plans, and then they provide incentives for municipalities and provinces to adopt them. So we're effectively following the same model. Nothing's being imposed, so there's no jurisdiction being infringed upon. It's we're creating a gift, and they can take it if they want it.
I think
That would be one interpretation. Yeah.
imposition is in the eye of the receiver. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to CMHC. Narusha, maybe you can, you can ask whatever questions you like, but maybe you can also explain how you might get provinces to love this
I'll
idea.
leave that to people online.
Okay, all right. Take it away.
Okay, perfect. I appreciate your policy package integrated solution approach. I was just wondering, given that there's so many different government priorities, if there is one that you could choose that's the most urgent or would have the most impact, which one would you recommend that CMHC tackle right now?
It has been voted that it is me. A national database. Again, though, the reason for that is because a national database is sort of meant to combine a bit of everything here, in the sense that it should be collecting information on building energy performance, as well as information about what kind of resources exist at the government and private levels for landlords to actually pursue retrofit programs. Like we said, landlords often find that they don't have the time or capacity for this, so this should help them do that. So this will help them to not only identify areas to improve on energy efficiency in their own homes, learn about what other buildings are doing to address it, calculate energy savings, and also find skilled contractors and coordination service providers who can help them actually get this done. This way, they're not going crazy, making phone calls to contractors and as I'm sure many people who have renovated their homes are familiar with. So it's meant to sort of streamline the process and just reduce barriers as much as possible.
Narusha, anything else? So there are a number of CMHC colleagues online. I want to encourage you, CMHC people, to not be bashful. If you want to speak now, please do. If you want to send a question into the chat box, we have people monitoring the chat box. But unless I hear or see something quickly, I'm going to open it up to the floor. And in fact, as we go through the floor questions, if CMHC steps in. We can do that. Here we go. Here is a non-bashful CMHC person. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I just want to, first of all, congratulate the team here for this amazing presentation and the thought that you've taken to share this with us and to go through these great ideas. As you were speaking, I just thought it made me think of the role of tenants, because we know bricks and mortar, you can build that building as energy efficient as possible. But tenants have a role to play as well when it comes to their lifestyles and it comes to their respect perhaps for energy efficiency within that building. So I guess where I'm going is that we can build the building as energy efficient as possible, but tenants still have a role to play with the overall commitment to net zero that we have as a community, as a country. And I'm just wondering, where do you see the role for tenant education and maybe tenant advocacy? Because that's a part of the pie that we also need to have in our discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So this was something that we did include in the public engagement strategy of the policy package. So it is incredibly important to address the tenant consumption side of things. Because as you mentioned, you can do an energy renovation, but if the consumption habits either don't change or actually change in the opposite direction, it can actually offset those energy savings. So this education is incredibly important. It's also part of what the community-led coordination services is getting at, because there is an immense potential to also incorporate energy efficiency education into that toolkit. So strategies for reaching out to neighbors and sharing facts and figures and also stories and things that get people involved and meeting them where they're at in terms of how they're understanding energy consumption. Again, if it's able to be specialized to different localities, that would also help, because as has been pointed out, what matters in one province for reducing energy consumption may be completely different in another. And so, educating people on whether that's heat pumps or what it means to air seal your home or what a building envelope is, I think this will all take public education. And so tapping into neighborhood networks where communities are talking about this, where maybe they're getting together and they're figuring this out together. I think there's immense potential for that learning process to be built into what is provided in the toolkit and the community services that are built out of that.
Weston tells me that we have 2 other questions online. Here they come.
Hi, I think I'm next. My name's Leanne Elliott, and I'm a Senior Manager of Policy Outreach here at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So just echoing Vivian's congratulations to the 3 of you for making it to this day. And I know it was a lot of hard work, and it clearly shows. So I have kind of a 2-part question for you. The first part is, how challenging was it as a team to be kind of forced into non-financial policy tools in your scoping of this challenge? And then part 2 of my question is, now that you know so much about the state of Canada's market rental supply and the need out there, are you more or less positive about Canada's ability to meet its net zero commitments?
So to answer your first question is, it is true whenever you talk to a stakeholder in this area, one of the first things they say is the thing we need is funding. It is the first thing that they say. However, it's not as hard as you would think to find alternative solutions. There are plenty of other issues, as you mentioned, that go beyond just access to money. And so really, when you're talking about how to make it easier, right, you can have all the money in the world, but if there's no one to build your retrofit, then it kind of doesn't matter, right? You can have all the money in the world, and if you can't find the data, it doesn't matter. And if you can't coordinate with your neighbors to do it, throwing money at the problem doesn't necessarily fix it, right? So it was an initial struggle, but once you really read into it, you can find out that there's tons of different avenues to go. Now, in terms of Canada's ability to meet net zero, I mean, look, it will take political will, it'll take a lot of economic planning, it'll take effort. But what we found is that there are the pathways to do it. Like, they're there. They're not impossible. And so if we try really super hard, then I think it's actually possible.
Yeah. Also, Just to add quickly, another consistent thing that we heard from our stakeholders is that many landlords are actually really interested in retrofits. They love the idea of helping the environment while also improving the value of their properties and the longevity of their properties, because retrofits don't just help the environment, right? They could also help landlords by making their investment, which, their property, more appealing to tenants, for example, and just last a lot longer into the future. However, the issue for even those landlords who have the resources, because there are plenty of landlords out there who do have the resources to do this, but they lack the time, or they lack the capacity, or they don't know who to contact, or etc. So it just continues going down that route. So trying to reduce those barriers as much as possible. So again, even though we couldn't do financial tools, on the other hand, we're trying to just make things as easy as they could possibly be.
Weston, do we have one more?
Hey there. This is Mark LeBlanc from CMHC. I'm with the Policy Outreach team. First of all, congratulations on finishing this year's project. It's been an absolute pleasure working with the three of you. And it's been a great learning experience for myself, getting involved in this project on our end. Kind of to dovetail on Leanne's question, thinking about the three policy solutions that you're putting forward, they're all more or less voluntary in nature, and thinking a little bit more on, what kinds of strategies you would use to incent participation, whether it's from PTs in a national kind of training program, or the holders of the data in terms of incenting the participation in a national database. Could you talk a little bit about, what kind of strategies some of the stakeholders you talked to thought would be a good way to kind of incent participation in these solutions?
Sure. Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for your question and all of your support throughout this process. Something that we explored a little bit and a little bit more in our full brief was the housing, the housing forum? No, sorry. The housing. The agreements? No. Sorry. There's a forum by which all of the provinces and territories get together with CMHC, and they discuss, housing policies and things that affect housing across the board. There are bilateral agreements that are made between CMHC and the provinces and territories, and I believe also regional agreements. And so there is an immense potential for getting people in the same space and getting them to talk about these issues in a candid way, and to sort of put things on the table, and to collaborate and compromise and create agreements. And so that forum was something that we drew inspiration from when we thought about the Retrofit Commission and the forum that would flow from that, in that when people are working together, having them actually get together and collaborate has a lot of potential. There also are a lot of things that exist within those agreements that can be leveraged. So for example, in some of the bilateral agreements that exist between CMHC and the provinces and territories, there actually are data sharing agreements that exist in that can be leveraged. And I believe same with different aspects of the labor question. Simon can probably speak to what those agreements are called as well. But looking at what infrastructure exists for collaboration, building on that, and getting people at the high level working together, but allowing for space for that to flow down also at micro levels for additional collaboration.
Okay, we are running a little bit late, so could I now open it up to the floor for questions? All right, Veronique is first on the list.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to your second recommendation because I cannot wrap my head around it. And I hear my colleagues from FedProv pulling out their hair even across McGill College. So I'm just wondering, I understand what you mean about going through every loophole possible to put forward a curriculum based on training. But I do recognize that provincial jurisdictions, some are more sensible than others, and I would assume that education is a highly sensitive one. So I'm just wondering, why haven't you put forward maybe more a pathway towards collaboration and bringing people together rather than going through the back door and putting forward a curriculum and incentives for which education centers, whether it be universities, CEGEPs, or whatsoever in Quebec, for instance, who receive funding from the provincial government would maybe either endanger or at least have high levels of risk to implement that curriculum shared by CHMC. So just maybe I would like some explanation on that second recommendation and why did you go basically towards that more loophole way instead of just collaboration and a hand forward?
It's an interesting question. So maybe one way to sort of frame it is to look at one of our case studies, right? So that was the Red Seal program, right? Where it's effectively create something that can be recognized across the country regardless of where it's done. This allows people to sort of have trust, right? We discussed this, right? But it's something that it's voluntary because we don't want to force it on them. And we also decided that one of the best ways to do it is to go through the trade schools in collaboration, remember, with those trade schools specifically, so we can get their educational input, as well as being able to pilot it to get that provincial sort of lens to figure out how it can be changed for the individual areas. In terms of why we didn't sort of try to be nicer to the provinces, which I guess is your question, right? I think, honestly, one of the bigger reasons is urgency in one of these, right? If we ever want to meet our climate targets, it is necessary for us to start kind of get going on this. Now, this doesn't mean that the provinces can't be brought in later. There are plenty of programs that have been adopted across the country that started as sort of a gift, to use my funny word earlier, right, that can be adopted voluntarily. And then through political pressure, provinces adopt that as their actual policies across the country. Healthcare actually followed a similar route, right? So there are ways to do this in a sort of more loophole-y way, and we think long-term, that's when we would be more collaborative to try and get their input on the program as it rolls out. But I think also another thing is that you need to have proof of concept that this can work. So if we develop it quickly this way, show that it works, and then bring the provinces in afterwards, we think that'll create a more cohesive policy solution that'll work in the long term.
Okay, any other questions? I've got one. So I'd like to ask a question. It doesn't have to be to Simon, but I'll motivate it that way. Simon, you so eagerly identified the supply constraints and not a demand-driven outcome. So you got a supply constraints with the supply of trained trades workers. So let's suppose you do your recommendation number 2, and let's suppose you solve the Fed-Prov issues, which I think might be a small miracle. But let's suppose those are solved. My question is, because you said on that slide, this will increase the pool of trained workers. So my question is, why do you believe that? So in other words, where are those workers now? The ones who will become trained? Are they just sitting around, are they like lined up at these trade schools, you know, pounding on the doors? They want to get in, but there's no curriculum yet because the feds haven't come in on their white horse yet. You know, is there an excess demand by workers for this training, or are they going to have to be attracted away from some other part of the economy?
So there's 2 answers to that. The first answer is a lot of the construction workers in the oil sands production, which are currently scaling down, a lot of those folks are going to need jobs. And a lot of those folks can find jobs in the retrofit industry as we transition to a greener economy, right? That's one of the things that we're going to be investing in pretty significantly over the course of the next 50 years or so. And so this is a pool of workers that are there that are able to be transitioned over, which the training program can help with. Now, another thing that we didn't mention, but it's in our report, is that in a lot of ways, the retirement of workers is not being replaced by immigration because of the way that we are currently kind of focused towards white-collar workers. If we could have some kind of policy that attracts qualified immigrant workers as well, especially having their credentials recognized, which is pretty clear. If we could have their credentials recognized and then tapped into this training program, these are your 2 pools that will increase the general supply.
Anybody else? 16 seconds.